Okay, so in the last video, Akari woke up, and it turns out that for the next shot and apparently subsequently in the video, there I am showing the design for the room. The room that she wakes up in, which is her dormitory, her school dormitory. It's not a college. It's in America, dormitory usually means college, but this would be like a high school. The details of which I won't get into, but the point is this is where she wakes up. And so as we discussed it was pretty apparent that this room is going to come up again and again. And it's going to be kind of important to see it from different angles and whatnot. So it's like, okay, let's go ahead and create this in 3D. So here I am working in Blender. For those of you that are Blender 2.8 fanboys, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm using 2.79 because the truth is I don't like 2.8 very much yet. That may change as I continue to grok out its idiosyncrasies and all the rest, but for the moment, the really fast GPU rendering is really the only thing about it right now that's really compelling to me. So anyway, in order to be able to actually get some work done and not like dink around all day with figuring out why things don't operate the way I expected, it was more sensible to just go forward with a version of Blender that I already kind of sort of know pretty well. The truth of the matter is my greatest familiarity is with the 2.49 and earlier versions of Blender, but I just really never got that on board with the 2.5 series, if the truth be known, but I'm pretty comfortable with it, and I have to say the grease pencil stuff was definitely a cool addition. But I just don't feel like the 2.8 version of the grease pencil has any compelling benefits that make it worth spending a lot of time with, because the things that it does that's new over and above 2.79, it actually does not do as well as almost any other animation program, 2D animation program that you could choose. So I won't go any further with that at the moment. What you see here, basically, I'm just going to kind of go over what some of the takeaways were from this process. Number one, this is a bunch of boxes. I mean, for the most part, it was really about creating boxes, bringing them down to the appropriate dimensions to represent construction elements such as drywall or 2x4s, and then just doing a lot of copying. So one thing you want to make a distinction about when you're trying to work this way and sort of quickly construct an environment is whether you're making duplicates or clones. Okay? In other words, if you have a scenario like this that consists of a whole bunch of boxes, you're going to be copying those boxes. Well, a lot of times it's beneficial to not actually copy them, but to clone them. So in Blender, what you would do is, if you want to make a copy, you would go Shift D, which is Shift Duplicate. But if you hit Alt D, then you're actually creating a clone. Well, what's the difference? The difference is that with the clones, if you hit the Tab key and go into edit mode and change something about the geometry, all of the clones update the same. Okay, so that means you're able to create one item like, say, a 2x4, and you can make as many copies of it as you want. And if you find out that the 2x4 was 6 inches too short, and you go ahead and lengthen it in edit mode, all of the other ones will be made longer as well, which is kind of useful. So in this particular scene or environment, we don't need to get down to the microscopic level of detail that one might go to if you were creating a feature film and you need a photorealistic environment. This is for an anime, so it can be cartoony, it can be simplified, and in many cases it's going to be hand painted over. Having said that, I do suspect we'll be doing a fair amount of UV mapping and or traditional texture work with the materials in order to do things like let's say, wallpaper. Um, you know, if there's books on a bookshelf, I suppose the likelihood would be that we would simply take a photo of a real bookshelf, kind of turn it into a cartoony look, and just map that to a box, and now from a distance it looks like a bookshelf. So this was definitely interesting from a scale relationships standpoint. The room is essentially a 10 by 10 room, with the caveat that the one end of the room that we're kind of working on right now with this bunk bed. This is a bunk bed that I'm constructing. It might be hard to tell that, but so I'm kind of adding support, like 2x4s to support the structure. I'm trying to use a little bit of common sense. I'm not exactly a, your top shelf handyman kind of guy, but I do have a little bit of knowledge of kind of how things are put together, and so I try to use a little common sense about that. And so what you also see me doing here is actually switching between two screens. So in the one screen I have it in rendered mode, and the other normally wireframe but sometimes solid. So that way I can kind of see what the lighting's doing, because in this particular scene it turns out that the lighting is kind of important in terms of how it comes into the room, because Akari is in one of the 3 beds. So another thing that came up was the difference between keeping your workspace organized with layers versus just using the isolate capability. I did ultimately put the various parts of the scene into layers. So I don't remember what they were at this moment, but let's just say the wall and the floor, or the walls and the floor, let's say they all go in layer 4, because 4 rhymes with floor, or some stupid thing like that. But one of the problems I ran into later was that I had to position the handles, and I'm sharing this just because this is like a real world thing you'll bump into, where you go, oh geez, this is kind of slows me down. What are we going to do about that? In the case of the desks, the drawers needed handles on them. Okay, so, and the problem was that in 3D space, from the front point of view, the desks are pointing in at each other. So even if I had all the desks and all their accoutrements in a single layer, and I isolate that layer, I would have the problem of if I wanted to be in solid mode to really see what was going on, I would have to look through one desk to the other. So it's like either be in wireframe mode, or you've got to get one of the desks out of the way so you can see the face of the other one. I know that sounds like kind of a, it's I bring it up because it's the kind of thing that when I describe it and I hear myself describing it, I think, really, dude, that's just like ridiculous, just move it out of the way, which is what I did right there. I actually took all the components of a single desk, parented them to an empty, and then what you see me doing right there is just cloning them. I'm pretty sure they're clones. I don't think that they are copies. So it does sound kind of stupid, because really, the desk is in your way? I mean, come on, it's a 3D environment. Just move the thing out of the way. And that's what you do. You take a hold of the empty, and maybe you move it up, but you hold the control key so that it moves in increments, and you go, okay, so three clicks up gets it out of the way, and then I know that 3 clicks down puts it back in the original exact position that it was in. Now, there's other ways to skin that cat. One would be to just take a note. If you notice here on the screen, not all the way to the right, but in the main 3D view, the bars that just change right there, you can see the transformation data. Okay, so the location, rotation, and scale data can be manually edited. So another solution to the little issue I was talking about is just take note, say, of the position in Z space of the empty for the one you want to get out of the way, move it out of the way, and then just make sure you put it back in the same Z space location where it was. So there's more than one way to solve that problem. But what I found myself doing in practice sometimes is just hit the isolate key. So in other words, grab a big group of items that you want to work with at one time, like a desk and the empty that it's parented to or linked to, okay, and then hit the slash key on the numpad of your keyboard. And that puts whatever's currently selected in isolate mode. In other words, you don't have to fiddle with layers. Everything else in the scene disappears, and you can just work with just that thing that you're fiddling with. And on you go, and then you just hit the slash key again to magically have everything else in the scene appear. So it's kind of the opposite of layers. The idea with layers would be, let's stick something in the layer so that I can judiciously make it disappear, get it out of my way. And again, you can do the same thing in the outliner. I know that. You can go into the outliner and just click the little eyeball button so things don't appear. Okay, so that would be a good way to hide things, but the question then becomes, what about when you want to isolate things? In other words, I don't want to hide this, I want to hide everything else. No matter what everything else is, I want to hide it. How do you do that? Well, you do that with the isolate key. So that's a little tip for you in Blender. If you're finding either the 2.8 collections a little unwieldy, or you're finding working with layers a little bit unwieldy, a good solution is to just keep jumping into isolate mode, work with whatever you're working with at the time, and then just jump out of isolate mode, and now you can see the big picture of everything in your scene or your shot. So checking the doors. Okay, so that was another thing. I haven't done 3D in Blender in a while, so I had to remember my hotkeys and stuff. So one really important one is Shift S. Okay, Shift S, what does that do? That takes an object like this box right here. Let's say I want it to rotate on a certain axis. Okay, so then I click, say, in the corner on the back of the box where I want it to rotate, and I want to set its pivot point or its axis or its center in a certain place. Well, the way you do that in Blender is with Shift S. And when you hit Shift S, you would say origin to cursor, or if you want the pivot point to be in the exact geometric center of the object, you would do origin to geometry. But the hotkey is Shift S, and importantly, you can't do that in edit mode. Now, I tend to be in edit mode a lot, so one thing that kind of went haywire that relates to edit mode is that your hotkeys, was actually a huge one, and it had me stumped for about 10 minutes. The hotkeys on your keyboard, along the top of your keyboard, 1 through 0, represent the layers 1 through 10. If you hit Alt, I believe it's Alt, don't quote me on this, it might be Shift, but I think it's Alt. If you hit Alt 1, that would be layer 11, and Blender by default has 20 layers. Now this has been kind of supplanted entirely by the 2.8 collections scheme. Not making a comment on whether the collection scheme is better. I think that if you are getting into a really complex scene with lots of geometry and objects and all the rest, then probably the collections, the benefits kind of rise to the top in that scenario. However, the 20 layers that exist in Blender by default have worked pretty well for 20 years, so for me, I'm okay with the layers scheme. But there was one thing I didn't know, which is that being able to quickly select your layers with the number keys across the top of your keyboard stops working if you're in edit mode. Oh my gosh. So all of a sudden I can't access my layers. It's like I'm hitting the keys. I can still click the buttons, but I'm like, what the heck is going on? And it took a while, fortunately only about 10 minutes, when I realized, okay, if I jump out of edit mode, all of a sudden they work again. So call me an idiot. That was kind of a stupid attack. But now getting back to pivot points, this is something that comes up again and again in 3D. And the idea is that you want to take an object and have it rotate where you want it to rotate. So in the case of a door, obviously where the hinges would exist is where you want the door to rotate. You don't want to hit the R key to rotate it on the Z-axis and have it rotate on its geometric center, because now the door is spinning instead of opening. Get it? Okay. So There is another way to do that. If you don't want to set the pivot point of individual objects and you don't mind your scene starting to get a little bit crowded with more objects, one thing you could also do is just add an empty to the scene and then parent your geometry to the empty and then just rotate the empty. Then the empty is going to rotate on its center and it's going to carry the object with it. So that's a different way to accomplish the same thing. In this case, really, honestly, at this point, up to the point I got to, it was really only the doors, the door to the room and the door on the wardrobe that actually needed to be able to rotate, because ostensibly at some point, maybe we're going to animate somebody opening the door and coming in the room, right? So it kind of made sense to set the pivot point properly. So one more time, if you got to set the pivot point on some geometry, make sure you're in object mode, not edit mode. And usually, if the best way to do it would be one of two things. Either click the object, hit Shift S, and then you want to put the origin to the geometry, which would put it in the geometric center of the object. Or, if you know that you want it to rotate in a certain way, put the 3D cursor by clicking wherever you want that pivot point to be, hit Shift S, and then put the origin to the cursor. So Shift S is quite useful because it does there's like 7 or 8 different options. I don't have it open in front of me right now, but there's quite a few options. Like another one would be geometry to cursor, which would take your current object and make it jump to wherever the 3D cursor is. Okay. I assume if you're watching this and you're still watching 16 minutes into it that you know what the 3D cursor is. If you don't, I'll just tell you that in Blender, there's this little widget that's on the screen basically all the time. And wherever you happen to click with a mouse, like you can see it right now in just right of center, you can see that little tiny widget there. That's the cursor. Wherever you clicked last in 3D space is where the cursor is. And it's quite a useful thing because you can, you can set things to rotate around the cursor. Anytime you're rotating something. So, okay, let me give a practical. Let's say I have an object and I want it to rotate in space around another object. Well, by clicking near the other object that it's supposed to rotate around and then hitting the period key on your keyboard, now when you rotate the object that's going to rotate, it's not going to rotate around its own pivot point or geometric center. It's going to rotate around the 3D cursor. Okay, so now don't do that thinking you're going to be able to make something rotate in a big circle, because that won't quite work. I don't think I'm going to explain why right now. Suffice to say, if you wanted something to rotate around a center point that's way, way, way away from itself, do what I said earlier. Either set the pivot point at that really far away location, or else put an empty in that area, parent the geometric object to the empty, and then rotate the empty. That would be making a lot more sense. Then you'd have some controllable rotation. So again, I won't get into why. If you experiment enough, you're going to find out real quick why. So anyway, with this video, we're getting close to the end here. I hope my blabbing has been useful in some way. If not, obviously, you can always watch the speed paint and mute me. But I think this is coming together well. I expect the room to be probably finished today, and then we'll be able to begin to put characters into the 3D space. I imagine the texturing is going to take a bit of time too. But with that, there will, as I always like to say, be more later.